Welcome pilots to another Jetworks build video. This is Bastian. He tested the Hawker Hunter and this is a maiden footage of the prop driven pusher version. It's fantastic. Nice and smooth, lovely flying. So it kind of drove me to go for my build myself. I went for the EDF version. It's the EDF build in this video. I've used Spray M77, 5-minute epoxy, Yoo-hoo pour. Here we are with the X-Fly 70mm EDF unit. This is a 6-cell setup. Definitely more power than it's needed for 4S setup, or even the 3 would be more than enough, but I've been wanting to try the X-Fly model itself. So what I've done is I've measured the can to see the length, and on the belly panel and both side panels marking out the length. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to keep the front former in its position, and then just move the back former back, like I say, on all three surfaces. That's the bottom panel and both the side panels as well. So just measuring it back to the length of the can, and then marking out the 6mm slot for the Depron. So like I say, chose the 70mm 6S version. Heaps of power, absolutely fantastic. So the first step in the video is the bulkhead number 1. Like I say, I'm using Yoo-hoo pour, the contact glue, but you can use whatever glue it is that you choose. I need to try other ones for sure, but we'll just keep going through the Yoo-hoo until that's done. And here I'm taking the side corner reinforcers, just lining it up against the edge of the belly panel to get that 6mm spacing gap. Like I say, the foam is 6mm, and just roughly mark it along. That's allowed the bulkhead number 1 to become a bit tacky, and then just slot that into place. So here we are with the lower reinforcers and the V bulkhead, the receiver tray. So once bulkhead 1's in, small amount of glue on one of them and smudge it together so it's a nice thin application, no more glue than you actually need. Peel off that, then add it to another one, and I've got it flat against the build surface so that I know that I've got a 90-degree there before I start trimming it. Now I didn't actually line up, you can see there's a couple of millimeters gap at one side. And then it asks for a 9mm cut. I'm just using a sharp blade and trimming along the sides to try and get a nice smooth angle. Once you've done it, and so do the same with the other one. Once that's done, a small amount of glue along the bottom side, smudging both of them together, as I say, you know, getting a nice thin even application of glue along it, not too much that it spills out. And then just adding a wee spot to the bulkhead itself. And then carefully just placing it as close to the lines that you've marked on the belly panel itself. As the glue is quite tacky, just putting it down small piece by piece, leaving a wee bit of an angle just to get it as close to the markings that you've made on the fuselage itself, or sorry, the belly panel. Then a wee bit extra that was at the end, I've just trimmed them off and put them up the front at the bulkhead 1 just to close the wee gaps that were there. Just a wee check and squeezing it into place, making sure that we're happy with the alignment. Then the next step is the V bulkhead. So these parts have already been trimmed. There's small angles on the front and on the opposite side. Both sides is reverse cuts. So I'm just adding a small amount of contact glue along the surfaces. Put them into place, and once we're happy that that's a nice tight fit, and the sanded edges all look pretty well. Just a small amount of glue onto the belly panel itself and just offer it up into place. Looks like a really good fit. And you want it to be nice and clean. Obviously the EDF version, you want a nice smooth airflow through it. So next step, now that we've got the bulkhead in, is the spar assembly. What I've did here is I've took the opportunity 3D print them. Simple enough. Both of them look fantastic. Look really good. Real done well. Proud of myself. Now I wouldn't suggest this for yourselves. I would suggest following the guides and using the 3mm ply. But I thought, you know, I'll give it a wee go. Took the plans that was there that's made available, and then I transferred that over into CAD and printed them, and it turned out pretty well. So the next step is installing the EDF unit and the tubes, etc, etc. Now I've obviously marked out the size of the can, and what I've done is I've got all the 3D printed parts. Let's just pretend the bulkheads are 3mm ply and foam. And I'm just lining it up to see how it looks, how it's going to fit. And I've printed the intake in red because I thought that'd be pretty sweet, having the red intakes. So I'm just test fitting against the rear wing spar bulkhead, possibly. Putting that into place, and it lined up very well. Now it slots in, the first part slots into the bulkhead, as you can see there, lifted out. The second part slots into that as well, and then I'm test fitting the intake itself. Quite happy with how everything's looking. A small amount of glue around the contact surfaces, just to make sure that, you know, there's a good bond. I certainly don't want this failing, because once it's down and all put together, then damn, it'd make a mess trying to open it up and fix it all. So happy with how the test fits are. So what I'm doing is I'm working from the front, moving back, because I think the way the slots and that all work in, it's probably best. And it'd be a wee bit of a pain trying to get the intake in properly. Excuse me. So yeah, just pushing in the first tube. Make sure it's nice and tight. Apply a small amount of glue in the contact surface here, the flange if you want to call it. And then meeting that up to it, so again it's nice, tight, lovely fit. A wee bit of excess glue there, just smudged it about. Wiped it off with my finger. You could just use a tissue or a scrap piece of paper or something, an old rag. Here, just make sure that when you're fitting the rear tube, the rear thrust tube into the bulkhead, that the bulkhead's nice and flush with the belly panel and the angled slots on the belly panel itself. Later on in the build I did have to trim a wee bit away on the spars where the carbon mounts fit. So here with the EDF bulkhead, the forward one, again just fitting the contact surfaces with a small amount of glue, just teasing it into position. And on the EDF unit itself, the rear bulkhead, just put that on and then slide the whole unit into place. Just trying to line each piece up as cleanly as possible, just to make sure there's no gaps and the air flows nice and straight. So once happy with where the intake right down to the EDF unit itself, once that's all fine, happy, just allow it all to cure and the glue to go off before I moved on to the exhaust thrust tube. I'm just trimming a wee hole for the wires here and test fitting it into place. It's quite fiddly. But the lightweight PLA is so easy to cut. And what I've done is just trimmed a wee bit at the bottom. But happy with how it looks, just checking along the internals just to make sure again it's nice and clean, nice clean flow all the way through. A small amount of glue on the contact surface again. And then just smudging it about so there's a good amount on both sides. Again, just lining up to make sure I'm happy with it. Make sure it's nice and square, as they call it. Making a circle nice and square. And then once the glue was all tacky and pretty good, I just left it up on its tail to have any supporting weight pushing down against it. Next step is the upper reinforcer corners. There's a small gap or hole for wires on the EDF can. I just used some fibre tape and taped it up there. So here we have the upper reinforcer corners. Again, small amount of glue in one. Smudge it about and then using each piece just line it up against the next former itself. Now there needs to be I think it was a 35mm cut. So what I've done is I waited until I got the side panels and stuff up aligned onto the fuselage itself before I decided to go and cut things, just so it was nice and neat. So here we are, just lining it up to make sure everything fits pretty well. Now I'd made a small mistake with the side panels. I had to allow a wee extra gap. It was only supposed to be a couple of millimeters, but I cut it at the wrong side, surprisingly enough. So here we are, we've trimmed off we've got the side panels onto the belly, quite simple enough. And then the upper corner reinforcers, adding them to it, just so that I can measure it up and make sure what I'm cutting is just enough that I need to, and certainly no more than that. You can see there, just behind the intake itself, the 6mm gap for the wing spars is actually about 12mm. I've cut a wee bit of relief at one side and had to cut it wrong obviously, and put some on the other side, but it's not an issue. So here we are with the upper reinforcer corners. They've been measured up, cut, the wee bevel cut and the 9mm cut along the side, and obviously the 35mm relief leading into the intake itself. So once they're attached and you're trimmed up and you're quite happy with everything, just apply a small amount of glue on the contact surfaces. So here we are going along the lower corner reinforcers and the EDF mounts itself, including the wing spars. All the contact surfaces that you can see. Just applying a small amount of glue, and I'll take the opportunity to apologise about the background noise. The printer's running away. Surprisingly, doing some lightweight filament prints for the F-15 Eagle. That's next on the hit list here. So back to the video. Once you've got your glue along the contact surfaces, just offer it up. Make sure it's nice tight, nice and neat fit. As you can see here, we're sliding it on from the front of the EDF intake. And I'm using some modelling pins just to hold it into position where we're allowing the glue to dry. And at the back there's a small curve just at close to the exhaust. So again, just a couple of small modelling pins just to hold it in place. And then all the way along it just to secure it, so there's no sitting off. You want it nice and tight and flush. Next step's the cockpit reinforcers and the bridge panel. Simple enough and easy enough. Once you've got them cut and trimmed, small amount of glue on one side and then just rub them together just so you've got a nice even application. Offer them up to the inside of the fuselage into place and just attach them as it is. Next step's the inner cockpit support panels. Again, just like the first set that we've applied, small amount of glue and just to offer up, and it fits perfect. Fits beautifully. Surprising that I don't have to trim much here. And then on the contact surfaces for the bridge panel itself, right at the nose, slide that in. And again, just using I'm just using a couple of modelling pins just to hold it in place. You can use tape or allow the glue to dry properly. So the next step for the EDF version is the thrust tube that we've already fitted and the exhaust mount itself, the exhaust bulkhead. So a small amount of glue around the contact surfaces, and you can see I've got a wee line there. On the plans there is a line marked for the centre piece, so I've marked a wee line with a pen just so that when it comes to lining up the printed exhaust thrust tube itself, it will line up nice and centre. As you can see here, the exhaust nozzle itself is the next step. So there it is, printed lightweight filament. I've got 2 walls on this and 0 infill in my big head. So I've lined it up. I put a small mark on that. I think it was 18 millimeters wide. Next step, the nose cone and the wings. So once we've marked up the exhaust, like I was saying, where the rudder goes, there's about 18 millimeters. So I just measured it out, marked a centre line and lined it up to the exhaust panel itself. So again, the nose cone, I've got 2 walls in this and 0 infill. Just adding some glue to the nose panel, the base of the nose cone, offering it up so there's glue on both sides, and with a nose cone aligner, and then slot it in and just allow it to dry. So if you've not got a 3D panel, then you would be using your foam and doing your exhaust cone, which was simple enough. And then once that's done, moving on to the belly panel. So here I'm using 3M77 contact spray, just a light dusting of it along it. Get 10-20 seconds to possibly more, move it while it's on the belly panel into position. But it's great. Just removing the modelling pins before we go into the fuselage sides and the nose cone aligner pieces. It's really taking shape now. So the fuselage sides, just measuring that up, or we test fit, putting it in place, and that actually went on pretty well. I was really pleased with that. Do the same with the other side, we test fit on that side as well. We modelling pin in the way. What I'm doing here is a wee bit of relief for the EDF unit itself. The lugs on the EDF unit, I didn't cut them off, I've left them on it, but they were protruding outside the side panels itself, so I just cut a wee bit of relief with a blade and then just dulled it with the end of a Sharpie. Again, 3M77 spray along it, and then offered it up, and it was great. The front nose cone aligners here, what I've done, I've already sanded them to the shape as it shows in the plans, because trying to sand them with the EDF unit and the intakes there, it would be quite difficult to get the shape you're looking for. So in this step I have actually followed the build guide, believe it or not. So once that's all lined up, it's time for me to start checking out the electrics, make sure that you know, the fan's turning in the right direction. The ESC, I've actually had to cut an extra hole, make it wider. Obviously it's the 6S setup I'm running, it's not the 4S setup that it's designed for, so I've actually had to cut it a bit wider, and I've secured the ESC into place before we moved on to the wings. And as you can see here, what we do, have your wings on a nice flat build surface and tape it off the opposite side where you want it to be the presentation side. This step, on the, as we're looking at it here, we're looking at the underside of the wing, so putting on some extra tape there so that when we add the epoxy with micro balloons, we can scrape off any additional epoxy that's there, just so we've got a nice clean finish and as less epoxy needed as possible. So here, once we've measured it up, I think it was about 20 grams all in that I've measured here, and just placing it into the slots for the wing spars. And again, tease it out to the sides, make sure it's against the sides of the wing spars, not just sitting in the bottom, because it will stop any holes forming, and it'll give you a good bond on, you know, not just the spar on the bottom itself, but the sides, the contact surfaces of the wing plate itself. So once that's in, we've got the carbon fibre spars in. Just adding a wee bit additional epoxy just to make sure it's totally covered. And as you can see here, I'm not being very careful, I'm just giving it a good spread about, make sure there's plenty there, and then using the wee tape, the top tip from Craig, to get that nice clean finish. I'm just using that to clean up the epoxy, and then do the same with the opposite side. Again, I'm just using a couple of batteries to hold it flat against the plate while allowing it to dry. Here I'm using 5-minute epoxy, and I think, you know, on these parts of the build, the larger pieces, next time I'll go back to the 20-minute epoxy just to make sure it's done properly and you're not having to rush it and have the glue going off on you. So allow that to set, flip it over and remove the tape as flat to the wing surface as possible, just so that you're not putting any pressure on it and you're peeling it off the glue itself. So now that we've got a good finish, there's lines on the wing plate itself for marking where the feathering out, so that we can, when we add the 3mm top skin, we're feathering it out to about 4mm on the trailing edge. So I'm just using the plan, marking it along and then marking onto the wing plate. And then here again, I've marked in the ailerons position, and at this point this is when I'm going to cut the ailerons off the wing, and just carefully with a sharp blade, just run it through a few passes so it's nice and clean finish. As you can see, I've already pre-sanded it, giving it that feathered off edge. Once you're happy with that, we test fit onto the fuselage itself, and it looks brilliant. I was really happy with the fit. However, I did have to make a small adjustment and grind the rear slot for the wing spar, because it wasn't 100% true and flush on the belly panel when the glue went off, so that when I had the wings in position, you could see that the trailing edge of one of the wings was slightly lower. But we'll get around that, the joys of scratch building. So here again, using some epoxy on the contact surfaces, and then sliding in the wings itself. And then here what I'll do is I've put it on a couple of empty EDF boxes, so it's nice and flush. I can make sure both wings are at the same angle, so it's a nice flat surface. Next step, we're using the wing spars, the formers, to create the nice airfoil shape on the wings itself. Very simple enough, just a small amount of glue, whatever choice of glue it is that you use, making sure that the thick parts are at the front and the trailing edges just taper off to the trailing edges of the wing. But don't be worried about getting them back to front. Where the tab locations are, they'll only go in one way, and if you were to put it in the opposite way, you'll see that, you know, parts of the trailing edge, as it should be, would actually be poking over the front of the leading edge. So it's pretty simple enough to get them into place in the right orientation. So again, simple enough part in the build process. Put them all into position and allow it to dry. And then here for the former piece, where we'll be adding a 3mm skin, I've just trimmed a bit off the plans, lined it up against the wing plate, and then just drew a couple of lines as to where I'm going to be putting the 6mm inner formers. As you can see there, the right hand wing, or on the right hand side as we look at it, is a wee bit closer to the intake as it should be, but we'll just adjust that as we're putting it on. It's a bit better looking. And again, small amount of glue, contact glue, and then the back pieces, just put that in, that's not a problem, but the front pieces, gently formed them on the table and allowed the glue to go tacky before I put them in place. So really here we should be looking at getting your wiring all set and tested and ready before we move on to fitting the fuselage top pieces, because once this is down there's no more access. So I'd got all the wires, got the servos, everything in place, tested them, they were in the right orientation. As you can see there, I've glued down the first piece of the fuselage top, and I've got some modelling pins holding it in place. Now you may notice there, yes you will, there it is, I've actually had to cut a relief in the top panel, because as you can see the large ESC that I've got in there to run the 6S 70mm fan, it was causing a bit of grief. It was obviously too big for the top panel, so I've measured it up, cut it out, and what I've done is cut a 3mm piece, rather than, you know, trying to sand a piece out or shape it and cut it and doctor it. I've just cut a rectangle out the size of the ESC, filled it with a 3mm piece of Depron, offered up some glue, smudged it about so it was a nice even contact all the way along, and then slide it in and allow it to cure. So this part is the 3mm upper skins, and the tail billet. I actually missed the tail billet, that was later on in the build in my processes, but unfortunately I missed the tail billet putting that on, but I'm sure you can understand, it's simple enough as it goes on. So here we've got the 3mm wing cover, gently formed it over the edge, corner of the table, just to get a nice smooth curve in it that lines up with the wing and the formers itself, and then just test fitting it. Once I was happy with that, I'm using the trailing edge and the ailerons, or where the aileron should be, as my guide as to making sure it's nice and flush against it. That's a nice fit. The front I can sand down. I'd rather the rear trailing edge was nice and smooth, because we went through the trouble of sanding it down. So once you've got it into place, I'm just using a piece of low tack masking tape and holding it into place until the glue sets. Obviously we will be stretching it over the formers, so you want it nice and tight as possible. So I'm putting it on the top of the wing surface and then pulling the tape a bit tight, making sure the wing plates press down, and then again do the same with the opposite side. Gentle curve over the edge of the table, and then glue it up and tape it up and allow it to dry. So here we are with the ailerons itself. So a good amount of glue, on both the 6mm and the 3mm piece. And here I've printed TPU hinges. Just small pieces of flexible filament, just printed them off in a wee rectangle. Not used the Jetworks hinges here. I'm just trying out the TPU. I've used it a couple of times on other models, but I thought I'd give it a wee go on this one as well. And it works pretty well. Works pretty good. So next step should be the vertical stabilizer. And I am doing part of it. However, once it's all cut out and sanded, I'm using 3M77 spray, spraying it on the inside of one of the outer pieces and attaching the inner panel, just moving it about to get it lined up so that I'm quite happy it's nice and square. Test fit the servo, put that in place, and just make sure that the other side of the panel goes on nice and neat and there's nothing obstructing it before I go to glue that down as well. So what I'm doing here is just using a small piece of 3mm foam and just cutting out a small cover for the servo for the opposite side where the servo arm doesn't obviously reach out. Just to save putting in too much filler, just putting a wee bit of foam, glue that in place. I'll hide up that pretty nice. Obviously the servo's been centered with the arm on it, and I've actually got the connector on the end as well. So we spray with the 3M77 and then offer that up in place. Push it down so it's nice and firm. Just make sure it's nice and square, nice and even. I'm just using a wee Allen key and pushing it through just to make sure that all 4 points are even before we go looking at putting in the stabilizer, the horizontal stabilizer, and realizing that it's offline. Next step, turtle deck, whether you're forming it with Depron or choosing to 3D print it, and I've obviously 3D printed one. So putting the cockpit in place first, and once that's happy that that's in line, then I'm just putting a small amount of glue on the turtle deck former at the back there, just so that it's all lined up and it's a nice fit, and I'm quite happy with that. And then the bridge panel from the turtle deck to the tail, just making sure that there's no gaps or it's too big or anything. So next step, air intake leading edges and the turtle deck former itself. So again, I've printed these in lightweight filament. Again, just I think it's a wall on this, no infill, certainly not a structural piece. It's just going to become the cover to the Hoover, that is the X-Fly 70mm. So we sand so it's nice and neat and tidy before I offer it up. Fits pretty well. I've actually just at the point of the wing plate there where the wing skin goes on it, I did trim it back just a wee touch. As you can see, I'm just making sure it's absolutely flush. And then using a bit of CA glue just on the outside of the intake itself, and just holding the piece against it. Just watch that you don't CA your fingers to it, but I'm just pushing the edge of the intake up and against it. A wee bit of accelerant, and then do the same with the opposite side as well. Here just at the wing cover, just a small amount of Yoo-hoo just to make sure it's all neat and tidy and stuck. There's no moving about in any way. Like I say again, do the same with the opposite side. Flip it over, and as you can see, just a thin bead on the intake itself. Push it against the former, the leading edge, a wee bit of accelerant, just holds it in place. Next time I might put lights on it. So the intake cowling upper and the lower, see where I've feathered it off and shaped it so that it's going with the plan, so that there's a nice clean edge on both sides, so there's a bit of contact on both the wing plate and the fuselage itself. Here on the wing formers and the intake leading edge, I've just put a wee bit of glue on the intake leading edge, just so that that's in place and it's held nice and tight. And then again on the wing spars, the bulkheads just there, a small amount of glue on that, and it holds it at the front and these two key places. And then the glue that's along the cowlings itself will be held against the wing. So once the bottom's done, do the same with the top, just a small thin bead of hot glue, line it up, hold it till it goes off and it's in place, and that way it's nice and flush. You're not worrying about any contact glue popping off. Well, I'm not. And a small amount of contact glue along that's the surface where it's going to touch the fuselage itself, and just lightly marking it with a pen to show where it's going to touch, so that I know, there's a wee bit extra glue in there. And then like we did on the underside, just a wee bit of hot glue on the wing spar bulkheads. And it's just gently push it into position and then hold it until the hot glue goes off. Obviously if there is some small gaps, we'll cover that later on with filler. We spare tissue, wiping off any excess glue that was there. And then now that that's held in against the wing spar and at the leading edge, then we can actually, if the cowling pops off at any point, obviously other than the three mentioned, then you just push it in and hold it against the fuselage. By that time there's been plenty of air in and got the contact adhesive very sticky, and it attaches to the fuselage very well. Again, just a wee wipe up any surplus glue that's there. We all know how exciting it is sanding away yoo-hoo pour. So the vertical stabilizer. So now that we've got the fuselage and the wings and the cowlings and that already, I'm using some 5-minute epoxy just in the contact surface on the bottom of the vertical stabilizer. And again, there's a wee bridge panel there. I'm actually pushing some on the inside, so it's not just on the bases that there's going to be contact. And then just a wee bit glue on the exhaust as well. I did start putting it all along this part of the vertical stabilizer. Then I noticed, well, there's a big gap there, so there's no real need for it. So then I decided to put some glue on the fuselage itself. Here we'll also be using hot glue at the front. That way the hot glue will go off quicker than the vertical stabilizer itself, the epoxy. So at least at the front that's held into place, and I'm only holding the back down. So when that's held in and it's nice and tight, just remove any excess epoxy there. The front's obviously set in place, and then I'm just lining up the vertical stabilizer to have it as vertical as possible. So the next step is setting up the vertical stabilizer, and again using epoxy and making sure it's kept as horizontal as possible. I'm using a couple of old EDF boxes here just to make sure that it's even at both sides, and the mount, the spacing, I'm just applying a small amount of epoxy inside, well actually quite a good amount, so that nice and tight on both sides. The guide calls for 3mm ply. Here I've just 3D printed a couple. I don't have any spare ply available at the moment, so I'm waiting on that getting delivered. So I'm also using an 8mm carbon rod here, which I've cut out to fit. That'll go in place, and then the 6mm carbon spar goes through the middle, which will form the elevators itself. So again, on the opposite side, push that part in and try and measure it out so it's nice and even using the boxes. And here I'm just lining up the elevator itself just to see where it needs to be in terms of how far I want the elevators away from the tail itself. Make sure it's nice and flush. Got a wee set square, one from the kids' pencil case, and just marked it up, and just to make sure it's nice and flush and straight as possible. Allow the epoxy to set. So again, like I said earlier about the tail bullet, I didn't actually get that part, but here we are fixing the elevator, getting ready to epoxy it in place. Now I've taped off the other side, you know, both sides are taped off, and we're going to be adding the 3D printed control horns. Just be sure that, you know, you're putting it in the right elevator itself, and you don't end up putting it on where the opposite side of where your servo arm comes out to operate the elevator. So a small amount again, just in the slots itself. Now these will only go on in one direction, as you can see there. If you turn it round, it won't actually go in. It'll only go in the one orientation. Just smudging away a wee bit excess foam, epoxy, sorry. And here I've got the drilled out prop adapters on the end. I've just offered up the elevator to it, just to make sure that I'm happy with the positioning, where it's going to go. And then this is where I got a wee bit confused as to how I'm going to secure them. So I chose to do it upside down, and I'm thinking here, okay, so if I tape the top of it, which is obviously a presentation side, we want that to be as best looking as possible, or as clean looking. Just putting a wee bit of tape on the top, which eventually will be the underside when I flip it over, and again mount it onto the two FMS boxes here, just at the same height. And just a wee disclaimer, this is no an FMS sales pitch, it's just my favourite EDF at the moment, other than this X-Fly that I'm testing in here in the Hunter. So again, just mix up a small amount of epoxy. Here I'm using the 5 minute, I've added a wee bit of micro balloons to it as well. And just in the latter part of the horizontal stabilizer itself, where the 6mm carbon rod's going to go, that's where I'm adding the epoxy, trying to be careful to make sure none moves forward into the holding rod that's going to support the stabilizer itself. So I'm just kind of twisting it in, and I'm thinking it's no quite fitting the way I want it to be. So it was because of the tape was catching it. So I put it in at an angle, push it down so it's nice and flat and level, and then just did the same with the opposite side. And once I've got those both flat, quite happy with it. Just a small amount of epoxy on the opposite side, just to make sure that, you know, there's no gaps, and I've got a nice tight fit, and all the contact surfaces are glued. And that's pretty much it, pilots. That's your build for the Hawker Hunter. I hope this has helped those who choose to build the EDF version, or be that the pusher version. And really looking forward to seeing, you know, your builds, because this one was epic. And a huge shout to Bastian for letting us show the leading star, his maiden, at the beginning of the video. So here you can see mine, wee bit filler and sanding. Sneak peek at the maiden video. Awesome machine. So once we got a wee bit of sanding, you know, looking at the colours, as you can see there, I mix up my own, put a wee base coat of the sea blue tone that I was trying to get, a new tone for the drop tanks, and then the sea green was the hardest for me to mix, but I enjoy painting. So here it is, ZZ191 Jetworks model of the Hawker Hunter. We 3D printed canopy, obviously you can do it with foam and the pilots, and there she is, absolutely stunning. Once they're all together, here's Bastian's pusher version, again stunning model, and in flight the pictures that he's got is fantastic. So we'll leave you with a wee launch of mine on the maiden day. Now that's smooth. Yeah, certainly was. Huge shout to Craig for the awesome designs. Fantastic maiden, great fun, and a special thanks to Bastian for allowing us to show part of his maiden. Brave enough to be the test pilot and get this model flying.